Welcome back to RNG Small Ball. Today we're talking about one of the most fascinating storylines of the NBA season, the return of Jayson Tatum after a devastating injury, and how his comeback could completely reshape the playoff race for the Boston Celtics. Last spring, everything seemed to collapse for Boston in a single moment. During the 2025 Eastern Conference semifinals, Tatum went down with a ruptured Achilles tendon, one of the most serious injuries a basketball player can suffer. Achilles injuries usually keep players out for close to a year, and even when players return, there are real questions about whether they'll ever regain the same explosiveness, mobility, and confidence that made them elite in the first place. For the Celtics, it wasn't just losing a star player, it was losing the engine of their offense and the centerpiece of their entire roster construction. Tatum had been the face of Boston basketball for years, a multi-time All-NBA player, a consistent 30-point scorer, and one of the most versatile forwards in the league. He was the type of player every championship contender builds around. When the injury happened, the immediate assumption across the league was simple. Boston's title hopes were on pause until next season. But what followed over the next 10 months turned into one of the most impressive recoveries in recent NBA memory. Right after the injury, Tatum underwent surgery to repair the torn Achilles. The early stages of recovery were exactly what you'd expect. Weeks of limited movement, and then gradual physical therapy focused on rebuilding strength in the lower leg. At first, the goal wasn't basketball. It was simply regaining normal mobility and stability. Throughout the summer, the Celtics remained cautious. Tatum stayed close to the team, attending practices and games while focusing on rehab. Reports started to surface that he was progressing well, but no one was making bold predictions about a return timeline yet. Achilles injuries can be unpredictable, and teams are extremely careful with their franchise players. Then, things started accelerating. By the fall, Tatum had moved from basic rehab to controlled basketball activities. He began shooting workouts, then light on-court movement drills. Coaches and trainers noticed that his mechanics and balance looked strong, which was a major sign that the recovery was going in the right direction. By winter, the conversation changed completely. Instead of asking whether Tatum would play next season, the question became whether he might actually return before the end of this one. Eventually, he started participating in controlled 5-on-5 practices, a major milestone that signaled he was approaching game readiness. Finally, after nearly 10 months of recovery, Celtics cleared him to return. When Tatum stepped back onto the court for his first game, the atmosphere around the team shifted immediately. There was emotion, excitement, and also a lot of curiosity. No one really knew what to expect. Would he look rusty? Would he be hesitant? Would he still move like the same player? In that first game back, he finished with 15 points, 12 rebounds, and 7 assists while playing limited minutes. That stat line wasn't the main story, though. What mattered was how he looked. Comfortable handling the ball, confident attacking the floor, and already contributing to the flow of the offense. For a player returning from one of the toughest injuries in sports, it was an extremely encouraging performance. But the most interesting part of this story isn't just Tatum's recovery. It's the team is coming back to. The Celtics didn't collapse without him. In fact, they stayed near the top of the Eastern Conference standings for most of the season. That says a lot about the structure of their roster and the strength of their system. First, Jaylen Brown stepped into a larger leadership role. Without Tatum on the floor, Brown became the primary scoring option and carried more of the offensive responsibility. His scoring volume increased, but more importantly, his playmaking and decision-making improved as well. Second, Boston's system remained extremely stable under head coach Joe Mazzulla. The Celtics continued to rely on spacing, ball movement, and defensive versatility. Even without their best player, the team stayed competitive because their identity did not change. And third, the absence of Tatum forced several role players into bigger responsibilities. Younger players and bench contributors gained valuable experience handling the ball, defending tougher matchups, and creating offense. Now that Tatum is back, those players return to smaller roles, but with much more confidence and development. That's why his return is so impactful. The Celtics aren't a struggling team getting its star back. They're already one of the best teams in the conference, and now they're adding an MVP caliber forward to the mix. From a tactical perspective, Tatum's return changes several key elements of Boston's offense. The first is spacing. Tatum commands enormous defensive attention, especially beyond the three-point line. When he's on the floor, opposing defenses have to send help defenders or double teams, which opens driving lanes and clean shots for Boston's shooters. The second is shot creation. In playoff basketball, when defenses tighten up and possessions slow down, teams need players who can create their own shot late in the shot clock. Tatum is one of the best isolation scorers in the league, capable of hitting step-back threes, attacking mismatches, and finishing through contact. The third is defensive flexibility. At 6'8" with length and strength, Tatum allows Boston to switch across multiple positions defensively. That kind of versatility becomes critical against elite offenses in the postseason. Of course, there are still questions though. The biggest one is explosiveness. Achilles injuries can affect a player's first step, vertical leap, and lateral quickness. Even if Tatum looks comfortable, it may take time for him to fully regain the athleticism that made him such a dominant two-way player before. Because of that, the Celtics will likely manage his minutes carefully as the regular season wraps up. The goal isn't pushing him to full workload immediately. The goal is having him completely ready when the playoffs begin. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. What does this mean for the Eastern Conference playoff race? With Tatum back, the Celtics immediately jump back into the top tier of contenders in the East. Teams like the Detroit Pistons and the Cleveland Cavaliers remain major threats. But Boston now has the roster depth, defensive structure, and star power to compete with anyone. In the first round, Boston would likely be favored against any lower seed. Their defensive versatility and balanced scoring make them a difficult matchup for teams that rely heavily on one or two stars. The second round could be where things get interesting, especially if they face a team with elite size or physical defense. But if the Celtics reach the Eastern Conference Finals with a healthy Tatum, they could very realistically be looking at a championship run. Here's the bottom line. If Tatum returns to around 80 or 90% of his previous level, Boston is still a legitimate finals contender. But if he regains his full All-NBA form, the Celtics might instantly become the most dangerous team in the conference. And that's what makes his comeback so incredible. Less than a year ago, the assumption around the league was that Jayson Tatum would not play again until next season. Now, he's back on the court and he might be about to reshape the entire playoff picture. That's it for today's episode of RNG Small Ball. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to follow the podcast and share it with someone who loves basketball analysis. And let me know what you think. Are the Celtics now the favorites in the East, or is there another team you trust more heading into the playoffs? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.